Carson family, Dan, Megan, Sarah, 16, and Josh, 10, embark on their journey from Phoenix to Bitter Hollow, Arizona, in their packed SUV. The air in the car is a mix of excitement and nervous energy. Dan, recently appointed as the new high school principal, believes this move will bring the family closer and offer a fresh start away from the city's hustle and bustle. As they approach the town, they pass through a landscape that feels increasingly isolated. Dense forests line the road, their tall, ancient trees casting long shadows in the afternoon sun. The town of Bitter Hollow is quaint and old-fashioned, with buildings that seem frozen in time. The streets are almost empty, and the few people they see watch them with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Finally, they reach their new home, a grand Victorian mansion standing at the edge of the town, its once majestic exterior now somewhat weathered and overgrown. The house towers over them, its intricate woodwork and imposing structure both beautiful and intimidating. Despite its neglected state, there is an undeniable charm to it. As they begin to unpack, Megan feels an inexplicable chill. She dismisses it as a draft from an old house. Dan, lugging boxes to the attic, hears faint whispers that seem to come from the walls themselves. He pauses, listens, but hears nothing more. He shakes his head, chalking it up to fatigue and the stress of moving. Sarah is delighted with her room, which has a balcony overlooking the dense forest. She imagines spending evenings there, reading or simply enjoying the quiet. Josh, ever the explorer, roams the garden and finds a rusty old toy soldier partially buried in the dirt. Intrigued, he pockets it, unaware of the toy's unsettling aura. As night falls, the family gathers for dinner, trying to ignore the house's creaks and groans. They laugh about the quirks of their new home, but beneath the surface, an unspoken unease lingers. That night, as they drift off to sleep, the house seems to come alive with whispers and shadows. Megan is the first to notice something is off. She wakes in the middle of the night to the soft, eerie melody of a music box playing somewhere in the house. She searches but finds no music box. Dan, in a deep sleep, dreams of shadowy figures moving through the house, their faces hidden and voices murmuring indistinctly. He wakes up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, but quickly dismisses it as a bad dream. Sarah wakes to the feeling of a cold, clammy hand on her shoulder. She turns quickly, but there is nothing there. She lies awake, eyes wide, the sense of being watched making it impossible to sleep. Josh, unable to shake the feeling of the toy soldier's eyes on him, hides it in his closet before finally falling into a restless sleep. The next morning, the Carsons decide to explore Bitter Hollow and introduce themselves to the locals. As they walk through the town, they can't help but notice the way the townspeople look at them, curious yet hesitant. At the local diner, they are greeted with polite but guarded smiles. The diner's owner, Tom, is a large man with a gruff exterior but a kind heart. He welcomes them warmly, though his eyes flicker with a hint of unease when Dan mentions their new home. Tom quickly changes the subject, offering them coffee and pie on the house. Megan steps out to visit the nearby grocery store, where she encounters Mrs. Haggerty, an elderly woman with a lined face and piercing eyes. Mrs. Haggerty approaches Megan with a sense of urgency. "You've moved into the old Hargrave house, haven't you?" she asks, her voice low and serious. Megan nods, curious. "This house has a dark history," Mrs. Haggerty warns, her eyes darkening. "Many have come, but few have stayed. If you value your family's safety, you'll leave before it's too late." Megan, taken aback, tries to ask more, but Mrs. Haggerty shakes her head and walks away, leaving Megan with a growing sense of unease. Dan, meanwhile, visits the town's small library. He meets the librarian, Mrs. Dawson, a stern woman who seems reluctant to engage in conversation. When Dan mentions the Hargrave house, she tenses but eventually leads him to a section of old town records and newspapers. Through yellowed clippings and dusty ledgers, Dan learns that the house was built by Richard Hargrave, a wealthy but reclusive man who mysteriously vanished in the late 1800s. The house has a history of ownership turnover, with many leaving under tragic or inexplicable circumstances. A pattern of sudden deaths and disappearances emerges, casting a shadow over the house's history. As Dan reads, a chill runs down his spine. Back at the house, the family tries to settle in, but the unease lingers. Megan shares Mrs. Haggerty's warning with Dan, who brushes it off as small-town superstition. However, the sense of foreboding grows, and they can't shake the feeling that something is watching them. As darkness falls, the Carsons brace themselves for another night in their new home. The house is eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the rustling of the wind outside. Dan, feeling a mix of curiosity and concern, checks all the locks and windows, ensuring everything is secure. In the middle of the night, Dan wakes to the sound of a child crying. He groggily checks on Josh and Sarah, who are fast asleep. The crying seems to emanate from the basement. Reluctantly, Dan grabs a flashlight and descends the creaky stairs. The basement is cold and damp, filled with old, forgotten furniture and cobwebs. As he ventures deeper, the crying stops abruptly, replaced by an unnerving silence. He feels a cold draft and hears faint whispers, but the beam of his flashlight reveals nothing. Unsettled, he quickly retreats upstairs. Megan's sleep is haunted by a vivid nightmare. She dreams of a dark figure standing at the foot of their bed, whispering cryptic words in a guttural language. The figure's presence fills her with an overwhelming sense of dread, as if her very soul is being suffocated. She wakes up in a cold sweat, her heart racing, and feels a lingering sense of fear that she can't shake. She clutches Dan, who tries to reassure her, but the unease is palpable. Sarah, meanwhile, is plagued by an intense feeling of being watched. She lies awake in her bed, her eyes darting around the room, following the shadows that seem to dance just beyond her sight. She hears soft whispers calling her name, but when she turns on the light, the room is empty. She tries to tell herself it's just her imagination, but the sense of being watched is overwhelming. Josh, who had hidden the toy soldier in his closet, wakes up to find it sitting on his bedside table, its eyes seemingly fixed on him. He throws the toy into the hallway, but the sense of dread remains. He lies awake, terrified, until exhaustion finally overtakes him. The family wakes up the next morning, tired and on edge. The events of the night before hang over them like a dark cloud. They gather for breakfast, trying to shake off the lingering unease, but the house feels colder, darker, and more oppressive. Dan and Megan exchange worried glances, knowing that something is terribly wrong but unsure of how to address it. Determined to understand the house's history, Dan returns to the library the next day. He spends hours combing through old records, newspaper clippings, and town archives. The more he reads, the more he becomes convinced that the house is at the center of a web of dark and disturbing events. Dan discovers that Richard Hargrave, the house's original owner, was not just a wealthy industrialist but also a man deeply involved in the occult. Hargrave's journals, preserved in the library archives, detail his belief that the land on which the house was built held special, mystical significance. He writes about ancient rituals and ceremonies designed to tap into this power. As Dan reads further, he learns about Hargrave's descent into madness. The early journal entries are coherent and detailed, discussing his studies and experiments. But as time goes on, the entries become increasingly erratic and paranoid. Hargrave writes of hearing voices, seeing shadowy figures, and feeling a malevolent presence watching him at all times. One entry, dated shortly before Hargrave's disappearance, mentions a ritual to summon the Wraith, a powerful and malevolent entity. Hargrave believed that by summoning and controlling this entity, he could achieve unimaginable power. The final entries are almost illegible, filled with frantic scrawls about dark figures, disembodied voices, and a sense of impending doom. Disturbed by the parallels between Hargrave's experiences and what his family is currently experiencing, Dan returns home with a sense of foreboding. He shares his findings with Megan, who grows pale as she listens. They realize that the house's dark history is not just superstition. It's real, and they are in grave danger. Josh and Sarah, curious and adventurous, decide to explore the basement while their parents are out. They discover a hidden door behind a large, dusty bookshelf. The door is old and rusted, almost blending into the stone wall. After some effort, they manage to open it, revealing a small, dimly lit room filled with strange artifacts, old photographs, bizarre drawings, and Hargrave's journal. The room is cold, and the air feels heavy and oppressive. As they examine the photographs, they see images of Hargrave and his family, as well as strange symbols drawn on the walls. The drawings are disturbing, depicting dark figures and shadowy creatures. The journal entries detail Hargrave's descent into madness, his obsession with summoning the Wraith, and his growing paranoia. The final entries are barely legible, filled with frantic scrawls about hearing voices and seeing dark figures in the shadows. As Josh and Sarah read, they hear faint whispers and feel a cold breeze, despite the room being sealed. They quickly leave the basement, bringing the journal with them. They show it to Dan and Megan, who are disturbed by the contents. The family begins to realize that the house's dark history is more than just superstition, and that they are in real danger. Megan's nightmares become even more vivid and terrifying. Every night, she dreams of Richard Hargrave and a group of townsfolk gathered in the basement. They stand in a circle, chanting in a strange, guttural language. The air in the dream is thick with a malevolent presence, making it hard for her to breathe. She watches as a dark figure, with eyes glowing a sickly yellow, emerges from the shadows. The figure reaches out toward her, and Megan wakes up screaming, drenched in sweat. These nightmares leave Megan feeling drained and frightened. She shares her experiences with Dan, showing him Hargrave's journal and the symbols she has seen in her dreams. Dan is deeply concerned for her well-being, even though he remains skeptical about the supernatural explanations. Desperate for answers, Megan decides to visit Mrs. Haggerty again. This time, she is determined to get more information. She finds Mrs. Haggerty in her small, cluttered home filled with old books and strange artifacts. The old woman is hesitant, but eventually opens up about the house's dark past. Mrs. Haggerty reveals that her grandmother was one of the original townsfolk who witnessed Hargrave's rituals. According to her, Hargrave believed the house was built on a powerful ley line, a mystical alignment of ancient sites that could be used to summon and control supernatural entities. The townsfolk, drawn by promises of power and wealth, participated in these rituals, unaware of the dangers. One night, during a particularly potent ritual, something went terribly wrong. The entity Hargrave summoned was far more powerful and malevolent than he had anticipated. It began to feed on the fear and suffering of those in the house, trapping their spirits and binding them to the property. Hargrave and several others vanished without a trace, leaving the house haunted and cursed. Megan leaves Mrs. Haggerty's home with a heavy heart, knowing that her family is entangled in something far more dangerous than she had imagined. Supernatural occurrences in the house intensify. Dan is the first to witness a full-bodied apparition. Late one night, as he is locking up, he sees a shadowy figure standing at the end of the hallway. The figure is tall and gaunt, with glowing yellow eyes that seem to pierce through the darkness. As Dan approaches, the figure vanishes, leaving behind an icy chill. Megan, too, experiences disturbing phenomena. She hears disembodied voices whispering her name, sometimes in the middle of the day. Objects move on their own. Books fall off shelves and furniture shifts position. One morning, she finds the kitchen chairs stacked precariously on top of the table in a twisted, unnatural shape. Sarah becomes increasingly withdrawn. She often sees the ghostly figure of a young girl playing in the garden. The girl, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, appears to be around her age. Sarah tries to approach her, but the girl always vanishes, leaving behind an eerie feeling. Sarah starts to feel a connection to the girl, sensing her loneliness and fear. Josh, once fearless, is now terrified to be alone. The toy soldier he found in the garden continues to move positions. One night, he wakes up to find the soldier sitting on his pillow, its tiny eyes fixed on him. He throws it across the room, but the sense of dread remains. The next morning, he finds it back on his nightstand, positioned exactly as it was before. The family grows increasingly desperate as the house's malevolent presence becomes more pronounced. They feel trapped, with no idea how to escape the entity's clutches. With nowhere else to turn, Dan and Megan seek help from Father O'Connor, the local priest. Father O'Connor is a tall, thin man with kind eyes but a weary expression. He has faced darkness before and recognizes the signs of a powerful malevolent presence. Initially reluctant, Father O'Connor eventually agrees to bless the house. He arrives armed with holy water, incense, and a crucifix. As he begins the blessing, the air in the house grows cold, and a sense of dread fills the rooms. The priest feels an overwhelming malevolent presence, stronger than anything he has encountered before. As Father O'Connor sprinkles holy water and recites prayers, the walls of the house begin to tremble. Shadows flicker in the corners of the rooms, and a deep, guttural growl echoes through the hallways. The priest's face pales, but he continues the blessing, his voice steady despite the growing fear. The family watches, huddled together, as the priest battles the unseen forces. Father O'Connor warns them that the house is haunted by restless spirits and something much darker, a powerful and malevolent entity. He urges them to leave the house, but the Carsons are torn. They have invested everything in this home and feel trapped by their circumstances. Megan, desperate for answers, decides to contact Claire, a renowned medium known for her ability to communicate with spirits. Claire arrives with her assistant, a young man named Michael, and they set up a seance in the living room. The atmosphere is tense, and the oppressive feeling in the house seems to grow stronger as the seance begins. Claire lights candles and places her hands on the table, inviting the spirits to speak through her. The room grows cold, and the candles flicker as a presence fills the space. Claire's voice changes, becoming softer and more childlike as she channels the spirit of Emily, a young girl who died in the house. Emily's voice trembles as she reveals that Richard Hargrave's rituals trapped several spirits within the house. She explains that the Wraith is a powerful and malevolent entity that preys on the living, feeding off their fear and suffering. Emily begs for help, her voice filled with desperation and sadness. As the seance progresses, the air grows colder and the oppressive feeling intensifies. Shadows move along the walls, and the candles flicker wildly. Suddenly, a deep, guttural voice interrupts Emily, speaking through Claire. It is the Wraith, and its presence fills the room with a palpable sense of evil. The entity taunts the Carsons, promising that they will never escape. Claire, visibly shaken, ends the seance abruptly. She warns the Carsons that the entity is incredibly powerful and dangerous, and advises them to leave the house immediately. As she and Michael hastily pack up, The Carsons are left feeling more helpless than ever. Sarah's behavior becomes increasingly erratic and disturbing. She begins to speak in an archaic language, her voice deep and inhuman. She draws symbols from Hargrave's journal all over her walls, the same symbols that appeared in Megan's nightmares. One night, Megan finds Sarah in a trance-like state, carving a symbol into her bedroom wall with a knife. Her eyes are blank, and her voice is filled with malice. Dan and Megan are horrified and call Father O'Connor for help. The priest arrives and confirms their worst fears. Sarah is possessed by one of the spirits trapped in the house. The entity controlling her is powerful and dangerous. Father O'Connor prepares for an exorcism, knowing that it will be a battle for Sarah's very soul. During the exorcism, Sarah's body contorts unnaturally, and she speaks in tongues, taunting the priest and her family. The entity fights back with a ferocity Father O'Connor has never encountered. The room shakes, and objects fly across the room. The temperature drops, and an oppressive darkness fills the space. Father O'Connor continues the exorcism, his prayers growing louder and more fervent. He sprinkles holy water on Sarah, causing her to scream and writhe in pain. The entity inside her lashes out, but the priest remains steadfast. As the exorcism reaches its climax, Sarah collapses, and the room falls silent. The family is left shaken, but relieved that Sarah appears to be free from the entity's grasp. However, Father O'Connor warns them that the battle is far from over. The house itself is a conduit for supernatural activity, and the malevolent presence still lurks within its walls. Following the terrifying exorcism, Dan becomes determined to uncover every secret the house holds. Recalling the mention of hidden rooms in Hargrave's journal, he spends the next several days meticulously searching the house. Every creak of the floorboards, every uneven section of the wall, is scrutinized. One evening, as the sun begins to set, Dan's persistence pays off. In the attic, behind a stack of old trunks, he discovers a hidden door. The door is camouflaged to blend seamlessly with the wooden walls, but a slight draft gives it away. With effort, Dan forces it open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. The air inside is stale and musty, as if it had been sealed for decades. The room is filled with ancient texts, occult artifacts, and an ornate, dust-covered mirror. The mirror, standing tall in an intricately carved frame, catches Dan's attention. Despite its age, its surface is remarkably clear, almost as if it's been waiting for someone to look into it. As Dan examines the room, he feels a cold, malevolent presence watching him. The ancient texts are filled with cryptic symbols and descriptions of dark rituals. One book, bound in cracked leather, details the creation of the mirror. According to the text, the mirror is a portal, a gateway to another realm where spirits and dark entities dwell. Dan realizes that the house was built not just on a site of ancient rituals, but as a conduit for supernatural activity. Hargrave, in his quest for power, had attempted to harness this energy, with disastrous results. The mirror is the key to the house's dark power, and it's been feeding the malevolent presence for over a century. As Dan delves deeper into the texts, he hears whispers growing louder, echoing in the small room. The air grows colder, and shadows seem to stretch and twist around him. He quickly exits the hidden room, closing the door behind him, but the sense of unease lingers. Father O'Connor returns to the house with a plan to exorcise the remaining spirits and banish the malevolent entity once and for all. He arrives armed with holy water, blessed salt, and a set of ancient prayers designed to cleanse the house. The family gathers in the living room, their faces pale and drawn with fear. As Father O'Connor begins the ritual, the house seems to come alive with malevolent energy. The air grows thick with an oppressive darkness, and the walls tremble. Shadows flicker and dance in the corners of the room, and a deep, guttural growl reverberates through the house. Sarah, now free from possession but still weak, clings to Megan. Josh stands close to Dan, his eyes wide with fear. The family watches in tense silence as Father O'Connor moves through the house, sprinkling holy water and reciting prayers. As the priest reaches the attic, where the hidden room and the mirror are located, the malevolent presence grows stronger. The temperature drops, and a cold wind whips through the room. Father O'Connor stands before the mirror, his reflection distorted and twisted. He begins the final part of the ritual, focusing on the mirror as the source of the house's dark power. The entity reveals itself in a violent burst of energy. Dark shadows coalesce into a towering figure with glowing yellow eyes. The wraith fills the room with a palpable sense of evil, its presence almost unbearable. It lashes out at Father O'Connor, causing him to stagger back. Father O'Connor fights the entity, using holy water and prayers to weaken it. The wraith roars in anger, its form shifting and writhing. The mirror vibrates with dark energy, threatening to shatter. The battle is fierce, with the priest struggling to maintain control. Dan, unable to watch any longer, grabs a piece of wood and joins Father O'Connor, trying to distract the entity. The wraith turns its malevolent gaze on Dan, who feels an overwhelming wave of terror. Despite this, Dan stands his ground, determined to protect his family. Finally, with a final, desperate prayer, Father O'Connor forces the entity back into the mirror. The wraith shrieks in fury as it is pulled back into the portal, and the mirror shatters into 1,000 pieces. The room falls silent, and the oppressive darkness lifts. Father O'Connor, mortally wounded from the confrontation, collapses to the floor. The family rushes to his side, but it's clear he doesn't have much time. With his remaining strength, the priest reveals crucial information. He explains that the wraith is a powerful and ancient entity, summoned by Hargrave's dark rituals. The mirror was its conduit, allowing it to feed on the fear and suffering of those in the house. Destroying the mirror has weakened it, but it's not completely banished. The only way to end the curse and free the trapped spirits is to destroy the house and the artifacts within it. The family is left reeling from the revelation. They realize their only hope of survival is to follow Father O'Connor's instructions. With a heavy heart, they prepare to destroy the house. Megan finds herself torn between the desire to save her family and the pain of losing their home. As the priest takes his final breath, he blesses the family, urging them to be brave and strong. His death leaves a heavy silence in the house, but his words give them the resolve they need to face what's ahead. The Carsons prepare to leave the house, but the entity tightens its grip. Doors slam shut, windows shatter, and the house itself seems to turn against them. The walls close in, and the air grows thick with malevolent energy. Shadows flicker and dance, and disembodied voices whisper threats and taunts. Megan, remembering the symbols Sarah had drawn, realizes they can be used to create a protective barrier. She quickly gathers the family and instructs them to draw the symbols around the house. As they work, the entity becomes more aggressive, trying to stop them at every turn. Dan and Megan decide to burn the house down. They spread gasoline throughout the house, knowing it's their only chance to destroy the evil within. The entity manifests more aggressively, throwing objects and creating obstacles. Sarah, still weak from her possession, struggles to keep up, but Josh stays by her side, helping her when she falters. As they finish spreading the gasoline, the entity makes a final, desperate attempt to stop them. It lashes out at Dan, throwing him across the room. Megan, terrified but determined, manages to light a match and set the gasoline on fire. Flames quickly spread, and the house begins to burn. The fire spreads rapidly, engulfing the house in flames. The heat is intense, and the smoke thick and suffocating. The walls crack and groan, and the air is filled with the acrid smell of burning wood and fabric. The family struggles to navigate through the thick smoke, coughing and shielding their eyes from the intense heat. Dan leads the way, breaking windows and creating paths for his family to escape. Megan carries a barely conscious Sarah, her body limp and heavy. Josh, terrified but determined, clings to his mother's side. The house seems to fight back, with debris falling from the ceiling and doors slamming shut, trying to trap them inside. As they reach the front door, a massive beam falls, blocking their exit. Dan frantically searches for another way out, his mind racing. He remembers the hidden passage in the basement and leads his family down, hoping it will provide a way out. The basement is filled with smoke, and the heat is almost unbearable, but they push through. In the basement, the air is stifling and visibility is low. The hidden passage is narrow and filled with old, crumbling bricks. The walls feel as if they are closing in, and the sound of the fire roaring above them is deafening. The family moves quickly, desperate to escape the inferno. As they navigate the passage, they encounter the spirits of those who died in the house. These spirits, now free from the entity's control, help guide the Carsons to safety. They whisper words of encouragement and point out hidden dangers, their presence both eerie and comforting. The passage leads to a small, hidden door that opens into the garden. The family stumbles out, gasping for fresh air. They collapse on the grass, watching as the house is completely consumed by flames. The entity's presence fades, and the oppressive weight lifts from their shoulders. The Carson family watches from a safe distance as the house burns to the ground, its structure collapsing in a symphony of crashing timber and roaring flames. The oppressive presence that had haunted them for months seems to dissipate with the smoke, and a profound silence falls over Bitter Hollow. The townspeople gather, a mixture of awe and relief on their faces. Some cheer quietly, while others, like Mrs. Haggerty, wipe away tears of relief. She approaches Megan, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You've freed us all," she whispers, embracing Megan tightly. Dan, Megan, Sarah, and Josh are taken to the local hospital. Doctors and nurses move quickly to treat their injuries, burns, cuts, and smoke inhalation. Sarah, who had been under the entity's influence, shows remarkable signs of recovery. The doctors are baffled by her sudden turnaround, as if the possession had never happened. Despite her physical healing, Sarah is left with lingering trauma, often staring off into space as if haunted by memories she cannot fully recall. Megan and Dan stay by her side, offering comfort and reassurance. They hold their family close, aware that while the house is gone, the psychological scars will take time to heal. The hospital staff is kind and understanding, giving the Carsons the space and support they need to begin their recovery. The town's atmosphere shifts in the days following the fire. Residents who had lived in fear for decades now walk with a newfound sense of freedom. Shops and homes that had been neglected are cleaned and repaired, and a sense of community blossoms. The Carsons receive countless gestures of thanks, home-cooked meals, handwritten notes, and offers of help. They realize that their ordeal, while harrowing, has brought the town together in a way it hadn't been for years. The Carsons decide to move to a nearby town to escape the memories of Bitter Hollow. They find a modest, comfortable house in a quiet neighborhood. The new house is modern, with large windows that let in plenty of light. Everything their previous home was not. Sarah begins to slowly recover from her ordeal. She starts therapy with a kind, patient therapist who specializes in trauma. At first, Sarah is hesitant to talk about her experiences, but gradually, she opens up. She describes the sense of being watched, the whispers, and the malevolent presence that had taken over her mind. Her therapist helps her understand that while the experiences were real, they no longer have power over her. Josh, once adventurous and fearless, becomes more cautious and reserved. He, too, begins therapy to process the trauma. He has nightmares about the toy soldier and the burning house, but finds comfort in talking about his fears. His therapist encourages him to take small steps towards regaining his confidence, and slowly, Josh begins to engage in activities he once loved. Megan joins a support group for survivors of supernatural experiences. The group meets weekly in a cozy, welcoming space. Megan finds solace in sharing her story with others who have faced similar horrors. She forms close bonds with the other members, who understand her in a way few others can. Dan throws himself into his new job as a school administrator. He finds that staying busy helps keep his mind off the traumatic events. He is determined to provide a stable, safe environment for his family. At work, he is respected and valued, and this sense of normalcy helps him regain his confidence. As the weeks turn into months, the Carsons begin to heal. They establish new routines and make new friends. The nightmares become less frequent, and the memories of Bitter Hollow slowly fade. The family grows closer, united by their shared ordeal. They find strength in each other and begin to rebuild their lives. Months later, the Carsons start to feel a sense of normalcy returning to their lives. Their new house becomes a true home, filled with laughter and warmth. Dan's job is going well, and he finds satisfaction in helping the students and staff at his new school. Megan's small business, a quaint little bookstore, becomes a beloved fixture in the community. She fills the shelves with carefully chosen books and hosts regular reading events. The store becomes a place of refuge and comfort, not just for Megan, but for many in the town. Her involvement in the support group also continues, and she becomes a source of strength and inspiration for others. Sarah and Josh adjust to their new school. Sarah excels academically and begins to make friends. She joins a book club and finds joy in discussing her favorite stories with her peers. Josh, though still cautious, starts to open up. He joins a local soccer team, and with each game, he regains a bit more of his former confidence. The family's evenings are spent together, often around the dinner table sharing stories about their day. They laugh, play games, and enjoy the simple pleasures of life. The traumatic events of the past are never far from their minds, but they no longer dominate their thoughts. One weekend, the Carsons decide to take a trip back to Bitter Hollow. They visit the site where their old house once stood, now a grassy field. The town has changed. It's more vibrant and lively. They are greeted warmly by the residents, who thank them once again for their bravery. Mrs. Haggerty, now much friendlier, insists on having them over for tea. Her home is filled with warmth and the comforting scent of baked goods. She shares more stories about the town's history and expresses her gratitude for their courage. The visit brings a sense of closure to the Carsons, reinforcing their decision to move forward with their lives. As the Carsons settle back into their routine in their new home, a sense of peace fills their lives. One evening, while unpacking a box of old keepsakes, Sarah finds an old, charred photograph among their belongings. One that wasn't there before. It's a picture of Richard Hargrave, smiling enigmatically, his eyes seeming to follow her wherever she moves. Sarah's heart races as she shows the photograph to her parents. Dan and Megan share a worried glance, realizing that while they destroyed the house, the malevolent presence might not be entirely vanquished. The discovery rekindles old fears, and they decide to burn the photograph, hoping to rid themselves of any remaining connection to Hargrave. Late at night, Megan begins to hear faint whispers again. She dismisses them at first, attributing them to her imagination. But as the days go by, the whispers grow louder and more insistent. She starts seeing fleeting shadows out of the corner of her eye, shadows that disappear when she turns to look. Dan, too, begins to notice strange occurrences. Lights flicker, objects move slightly, and the air occasionally grows cold. The family decides to take action, calling in a new priest to bless their home. The blessing seems to help, and the whispers and shadows diminish, but the family remains on edge. Despite these unsettling events, the Carsons refuse to let fear dominate their lives again. They continue their routines, leaning on each other for support. They know that while the evil might still be out there, they are stronger and more resilient than before. The final scene shows the family gathered in their living room, the fireplace crackling warmly. They sit together, a united front against whatever darkness may come their way. The camera pans out to the window, where a shadowy figure stands just beyond the glass, watching and waiting. The Carsons may have won the battle, but the war against the darkness is far from over.